East of Eden by John Steinbeck. Chapter 2. 1. I must depend on hearsay, on old photographs, on stories told, and on memories which are hazy and mixed with fable in trying to tell you about the Hamiltons. They were not eminent people, and there are few records concerning them except for the usual papers on birth, marriage, land ownership, and death. Young Samuel Hamilton came from the north of Ireland, and so did his wife. He was the son of small farmers, neither rich nor poor, who had lived on one land hole and in one stone house for many hundreds of years. The Hamiltons managed to be remarkably well educated and well read, and, as is so often true in that green country, they were connected and related to very great people and very small people, so that one cousin might be a baronet and another cousin a beggar. And of course, they were descended from the ancient kings of Ireland, as every Irishman is. Why Samuel left the stone house and the green acres of his ancestors, I do not know. He was never a political man, so it is not likely a charge of rebellion drove him out. And he was scrupulously honest, which eliminates the police as prime movers. There was a whisper, not even a rumor, but rather an unsaid feeling in my family that it was love that drove him out, and not love of the wife he married. But whether it was too successful love, or whether he left in pique at unsuccessful love, I do not know. We always preferred to think it was the former. Samuel had good looks and charm and gaiety. It is hard to imagine that any country Irish girl refused him. He came to the Salinas Valley full blown and hearty, full of inventions and synergy. His eyes were very blue, and when he was tired, one of them wandered outward a little. He was a big man but delicate in a way. In the dusty business of ranching, he seemed almost immaculate. His hands were clever. He was a good blacksmith and carpenter and wood carver, and he could improvise anything with bits of wood and metal. He was forever inventing a new way of doing an old thing and doing it better and quicker, but he never in his whole life had any talent for making money. Other men who had the talent took Samuel's tricks and sold them and grew rich, but Samuel barely made wages all his life. I don't know what directed his steps towards the Salinas Valley. It was an unlikely place for a man from a green country to come to, but he came about 30 years before the turn of the century, and he brought with him his tiny Irish wife, a tight-hearted little woman, humorless as a chicken. She had a dark Presbyterian mind and a code of morals that pinned down and beat the brains out of nearly everything that was pleasant to do. I do not know where Samuel met her, how he wooed her, married. I think there must have been some other girl printed somewhere in his heart, for he was a man of love, and his wife was not a woman to show her feelings. And in spite of this, in all the years from his youth to his death in the Salinas Valley, there was no hint that Samuel ever went to another woman. When Samuel and Lisa came to the Salinas Valley, all the level land was taken, the rich bottoms, the little fertile creases in the hills, the forests, but there was still marginal land to be homesteaded, and in the barren hills to the east of what is now King City, Samuel Hamilton homesteaded. He followed the usual practice. He took a quarter section for himself and a quarter section for his wife, and since she was pregnant, he took a quarter section for the child. Over the years, 9 children were born, 4 boys and 5 girls, and with each birth, another quarter section was added to the ranch, and that makes 11 quarter sections or 1,760 acres. If the land had been any good, the Hamiltons would have been rich people, but the acres were harsh and dry. There were no springs, and the crust of topsoil was so thin that the flinty bones struck through. Even the sagebrush struggled to exist, and the oaks were dwarfed from the lack of moisture. Even in reasonably good years, there was so little feed that the cattle kept thin, running about looking for enough to eat. From the barren hills, the Hamiltons could not look down to the west and see the richness of the bottom land and the greenness around the Salinas Valley. Samuel built his house with his own hands, and he built a barn and a blacksmith shop. He found quite soon that even if he had 10,000 acres of hill country, he could not make a living on the bony soil without water. His clever hands built a well boring rig, and he bored wells in the lands of lucky men. He invented and built a threshing machine and moved through the bottom farms in harvest time, threshing the grain his own farm would not raise. And in his shop he sharpened plows and mended harrows and welded broken axles and shot horses. Men from all over the district brought him tools to mend and to improve. Besides, they loved to hear Samuel talk of the world and its thinking, of the poetry and philosophy that were going on outside the Salinas Valley. He had a rich, deep voice, good both in song and in speech, and while he had no brogue, there was a rise and a lilt and a cadence to his talk, and he made it sound sweet in the ears of the taciturn farmers from the valley bottom. They brought whiskey, too, and out of sight of the kitchen window and the disapproving eye of Mrs. Hamilton, they took hot nips from the bottle and nibbled cuts of green wild anise to cover the whiskey breath. It was a bad day when 3 or 4 men were not standing around the forge listening to Samuel Hammer and his talk. They called him a comical genius and carried his stories carefully home, and they wondered at how the stories spilled out on the way, for they never sounded the same repeated in their own kitchens. Samuel should have been rich from his well rig and his threshing machine and his shop, but he had no gift for business. His customers always pressed for money, promised payment after harvest, and then after Christmas, and then after, until at last they forgot it. Samuel had no gift of reminding them, and so the Hamiltons stayed poor. The children came along as regularly as the years. The few overworked doctors of the country did not often get to the ranches for a bird unless the joy turned nightmare and went on several days. Samuel Hamilton delivered all his own children and tied the cords neatly, spanked the bottoms and cleaned up the mess. When his youngest was born with some small obstruction and began to turn black, Samuel put his mouth against the baby's mouth and blew air in and sucked it out until the baby could take over for himself. Samuel's hand was so good and gentle that neighbors from 20 miles would call on him to help with a bird. And he was equally good with mare, cow, or woman. Samuel had a great black book on an available shelf, and it had gold letters on the cover, Dr. Gunn's Family Medicine. Some pages were bent and beat up from use, and others were never opened to the light. To look through Dr. Gunn is to know the Hamiltons' medical history. These are the use sections: broken bones, cuts, bruises, mumps, measles, backache, scarlet fever, diphtheria, rheumatism, female complaints, hernia, and of course everything to do with pregnancy and the birth of children. The Hamiltons must have been either lucky or moral, for the sections of gonorrhea and syphilis were never opened. Samuel had no equal for soothing hysteria and bringing quiet to a frightened child. It was the sweetness of his tongue and the tenderness of his soul, and just as there was a cleanness about his body, so there was a cleanness in his thinking. Men coming to his blacksmith shop to talk and listen dropped their cursing for a while, not from any kind of restraint, but automatically, as though this was not the place for it. Samuel kept always a foreignness. Perhaps it was in the cadence of his speech, and this had the effect of making men, and women too, tell him things they would not tell to relatives or close friends. His slight strangeness set him apart, and made him safe as a repository. Lisa Hamilton was a very different kettle of Irish. Her head was small and round, and it held small round convictions. She had a button nose and a hard little set-back chin, a gripping jaw set on its course, even though the angels of God argued against it. Lisa was a good plain old cook, and her house, it was always her house, was brushed and pummeled and washed. Bearing her children did not hold her back very much. 2 weeks at the most she had to be careful. She must have had a pelvic arch of whalebone, for she had big children one after another. Lisa had a finely developed sense of sin. Idleness was a sin, and card playing, which was a kind of idleness to her. She was suspicious of fun, whether it is involved dancing or singing or even laughter. She felt that people having a good time were wide open to the devil, and this was a shame, for Samuel was a laughing man, but I guess Samuel was wide open to the devil. His wife protected him whenever she could. She wore her hair always pulled tight back and bunned behind in a hard knot, and since I can't remember how she dressed, it must have been that she wore clothes that matched herself exactly. She had no spark of humor, and only occasionally a blade of cutting wit. She frightened her grandchildren because she had no weakness. She suffered bravely and uncomplainingly through life, convinced that that was the way her God wanted everyone to live. She felt that rewards came later. 2. When people first came to the West, particularly from the owned and fought over farmlets of Europe, and saw so much land to be had for the signing of a paper and the building of a foundation, and itching land greed seemed to come over them. They wanted more and more land, good land if possible, but land anyway. Perhaps they had filaments of memory of feudal Europe where great families became and remained great because they owned things. The early settlers took up land and they didn't need and they couldn't use. They took up worthless land just to own it, and all proportions sane. A man who might have been well to do on 10 acres in Europe was rat poor on 2,000 in California. It wasn't very long until all land in the barren hills near King City and San Ardo was taken up, and ragged families were scattered throughout the hills, trying their best to scratch a living from thin flinty soil. They and the coyotes lived clever, despairing, submarginal lives. They landed with no money, no equipment, no tools, no credit, and particularly with no knowledge of the new country and no technique for using it. I don't know whether it was a divine stupidity or a great fate that let them do it. Surely such venture is nearly gone from the world, and the families did survive and grow. They had a tool of weapon that is also nearly gone, or perhaps it is only dormant for a while. It is argued that because they believed thoroughly in a just moral God, they could put their faith there and let the smaller securities take care of themselves. But I think that because they trusted themselves and respected themselves as individuals, because they knew beyond doubt that they were valuable and potentially moral units, because of this, they could give God their own courage and dignity and then receive it back. Such things have disappeared perhaps because men do not trust themselves any more, and when that happens, there is nothing left except perhaps to find some strong, sure man, even though he may be wrong, and to dangle from his coat tails. While many came to the Salinas Valley penniless, there were others who, having sold out somewhere else, arrived with money to start a new life. These usually bought land, but good land, and built their houses of planed lumber and carpets and colored glass diamond panes in their windows. There were numbers of these families that they got the good land of the valley and cleared the yellow mustard way and planted wheat. Such a man was Adam Trust.